Welcome to a new episode of Education and Democracy. This is episode number 17 with my guest, Professor Hooshang Amirahmadi, the distinguished professor from Rutgers University, professor of political science and international relations. In the last 16 episodes, we covered a wide-ranging territories about the relationship between education and democracy. And we talked about whether education is a necessity of life, the role of education in regeneration of societies and cultures and people in general and nations. And that brought us to the contemporary effect of education on democracy and vice versa. Professor Amirahmadi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Professor Kangarlu. It's a pleasure to be a participant in this panel and discuss the role of education in democratization of societies. I am here.
Last time we talked about the fact that democratic societies have a way of funding education and universities and various institutions, secondary education and the primary education. And then we talked about other institutions that play a role in education, society as at large, society, different institutions within society, and the family, and the roles that each play in education. And then we talked about the difference between education in the third world and in the United States. And we got to the point of discussing whether education and the way our youngsters are brought up and educated, does it have a stabilizing effect on our democracy, and whether there is something that we can do better in order to make them more politically aware and sensitive and more engaged with their own destinies and with the political participation, and whether a better education can actually help us to have a better democracy. What do you think about those issues?
Well, thank you. Great questions. Very important. Well, first, educational institutions, including universities, are obviously subsets of a society dominated by a particular mode of production. Either like feudal society has its own form of education, the capitalist society has a different one, and then within the capitalist society in different stages, universities or educational institutions also change their role, and they always try to fit the system, sort of. For example, in a liberal capitalist time, back in the 19th century, for example, perhaps even the early 20th century, we had a different types of education in the universities, for example, than we have today under illiberal capitalism or monopoly capitalism, a capitalism that is heavily involved in international competition as opposed to just national. So, for example, if you go back to the university education back in the liberal time of capitalism, sort of the so-called perfect competition time, where the market was the key. In those days, we know that the liberal social education was key. Education, the philosophy was a major sort of like department in the university, the most important probably department. And then there was the sociology, there was the other humanities, the history, religion, culture, and so on. And then came economics and politics and so on. So social science and humanities, broadly speaking, liberal education, and more importantly, even critical education, used to be the key, the center of educational programs, and as well as departments in universities across the globe, particularly in key universities in major countries like the United States. Again, and then if you, in the last time we discussed the fact that over time, as capitalism moved away from its original contents and its original form into a more illiberal and monopoly capitalist system, and it moved increasingly towards monetizing the society, and the money became dominant, the banking system, finance, and so on. And then the technical education became a key to survival of corporations and companies who wanted to compete domestically as well as internationally, but had to compete. So the educational system also moved away from the liberal education, from social and humanities, towards the more professional types of education. Education moved increasingly toward engineering of all types, and the engineering became like so wide open that within that word engineering, we ended up with hundreds of engineering fields that now people can specialize, and natural science, including medical science and so on. They also became so divided that you can actually now specialize, God knows, in so many fields or subfields within the medical science and so on. So again, this movement from liberal to, let's call it physical education was imposed on the universities by the developments outside the university campuses in the larger environment where they lived, that they had to respond to this new demands that was coming from corporations and international competition for education. So education in the universities moved from liberal to physical education. Physical education became increasingly more and more dominant. And by physical education, I really mean physical in the sense that there was little social in it. Okay, there was little about relations. It was little about ideas and critical thinking. It was all about learning tools, learning mathematics of doing things and so on. So like engineering, like medical science and so on. So that was a major change. The universities therefore increasingly became empty of the social content and filled with physical or professional contents. That was a major change. So increasingly more departments and programs were created in response to those demands coming from outside for professional education, for example. That professional education means that the universities started training people that, from the bachelor's to masters to PhDs and so on, people that knew to do all kinds of calculations, for example, but they didn't know what is the meaning of liberal. They knew everything. They could build anything you wanted, but they didn't actually know what critical means. Even the word critical, when you say critical, they will say what that is. Okay, so there was absolutely nothing about social, critical, liberal. This world became increasingly alien to our engineers, to our doctors, and so on. That's a major change. That is to say, we created engineers, but not human beings. We created engineers, but not a human being with any capacity to think critically, liberally, socially, to interact, to communicate, to involve in any relationship. Our engineer became like a robot. Basically, the robotization of our people that now we call engineers or doctors or whatever. That was a huge disservice to humanities, to the human societies, because after all, human society is all about relations, it's all about social. Unless you really understand that part of it, you become a robot. In fact, this is funny. What is now happening is that even that engineer, which had nothing to do with critical, liberal, or social, and had only to do with physical and the profession, now is being replaced by robots, by the machines they are making. So even that type of education is going out of business. I'm not sure if our universities soon are going to train engineers anymore, because you are creating computers that can think for you, that the robots that can do anything you want. You have to just push the button. And so again, we move from liberal education to professional. Now we are moving from professionals even to a completely something that we can perhaps call the machine life, the complete takeover of machine over the human being. And unfortunately, universities have a major role to play here. They have just, not only they have not resisted, they have basically obeyed, and submitted to this demand from outside. And they are just responding to what comes from outside.
But in a capitalist society, aren't you supposed to allow the demand to be the ultimate rule and the force in the marketplace, so that if the industries, if the economy is producing more jobs, engineering jobs and production jobs and technology jobs and manufacturing jobs, and the universities who are producing and training students in all disciplines, when they see that more students are getting better jobs in manufacturing and in advanced technology and high tech, they naturally are going to meet this demand and produce more students and more professionals with those kind of expertise. And so what are the universities supposed to do? I mean, if you go to university, you get a PhD in political science, in sociology, in philosophy, and in economy, and you get a master's degree in electrical engineering, and you get a six-figure salary with a Silicon Valley company, with Google, with Amazon, with some of the startups, and obviously the society is going to produce more of the job. So what are we going to do with that? I mean, obviously at the same time, our country is really going from manufacturing dominated economy to service dominated economy, and so during that transition, I suppose the universities are going to meet that demand. Whatever market demands, the universities will train. And so so are you saying that universities have to take a unilateral measure of training more people in sociology and humanity disciplines than in engineering and science, just because of the role they play in consolidating the democracy?
Yeah. Well, very good question, very good comments. First, obviously, we are not against, and I am not against the professional education. I mean, the fact of the matter is that they are imposed from outside. I think the last time we spoke about the balance, striking the balance between professional or machine and liberal education. The universities must consider very seriously to strike this balance between the two. They just can't submit to that force from outside, because the demand that comes is the demand from a certain group for a certain interest, for a certain way of life, as opposed to as opposed to demand that is coming from the general public. The demand that I'm talking about is not coming from the general public. It's coming from corporations, for example. And for the corporations, a good society is a different society than for an average American. For an American corporation, a good life is a different life than for an average American. But for corporation, the American national interest is different from the national interest that the average American has in mind about its country, this country or her country. In fact, there is a big saying, a major statement from Henry Ford that has said supposedly that my country is where my money makes profit, period. And then he said what, and then of course broadly, according to the invisible hand theory of Adam Smith, whatever that is good for American corporation is good for everybody. So those are the kind of sort of like theses or hypotheses or I don't know what the philosophical outlook that creates this kind of. The point I'm trying to say is that first, the demand that I'm talking is not a general demand. It's a demand from a certain group of people in the society. They are probably no more than 5% or 10% of the society that control 50, 60% of the national growth product in this country. All right, so that's one. Now, but should we submit to every demand that comes from them 100%? Or we should, while responding to that demand, maintain a balance between that demand and the demand of that additional 95% of the population or 80% of the population, doesn't matter. That majority out there that doesn't see American interest, the interest of Henry Ford, that they don't see the American, life, a good life for America, or a good society in America is what corporations in this country define. All right, so that's a very important point because I'm talking about assumptions that are being made here. I mean, American corporations are making the assumptions that a good society, a good life, a best way of achieving American national interest is what they think should be done. That 5% thinks should be done. I am saying that may not be the case. And in fact, history, at least the history of the last 70, 80 years has shown that that particular way of looking at America has indeed emptied American in terms of its serious liberal content. Now we are creating an America that is empty of that educational, critical education, liberal education, social education, philosophical education that at one point was dominant. So we are become all a bunch of machines. Okay, so beyond that, as I said, we are moving even from professional to machines. God forbid when the machine takes over completely. You know what that means? That means the human being for the first time will not be the master of the nature, that the nature will be the master of the human being. And that's the end of the humanity. That's the end of humanity. In fact, as we know, our effort throughout our history has been to master the nature, to control the nature, to use the nature, okay, to the best of our ability for the best of our interests. Now the time is coming that very effort is creating a reaction from the nature, saying from now on, gradually, I am going to become the master. The robots are going to be the master. Now the corona, the COVID-19 is the master. The COVID-19, I believe, is a man-made process. Not that it was a sort of conspiracy from the Wuhan lab. That wasn't the case. But the very fact that we are getting into the nature, into the core of the nature, discovering its laws, bothering this nature, it reacts. So I'm very concerned about the way we are going. I think science is going increasingly in a way that it is making nature to react, and the God forbid when that reaction takes over, we are finished. So I think it is the universities need to educate people in these terms. I don't know anybody in the universities have a course or a department that will look at the relationship between human being and the nature as we move forward. I mean, we are moving today. Information technology is the child play. We are moved way beyond the information technology. We have machines that are thinking for us. That the intelligence stuff that is coming. Okay, so I think what I'm saying is that the machine is taking our brain, placing it itself, and then taking that brain, controlling us. That is the future. Now, I believe the university is the only place that we have hoped for to stand in the way of this process is the universities. I mean, we can't think of like a high school or a primary school to do this. Universities are supposed to do it. That's where the liberal education, social education, natural education, professional education are supposed to be balanced. So again, I think, but unfortunately, there is a problem. And that's why we are failing in our educational system. Because what has happening, and this is the problem, not only these universities is not responding properly to this move from liberal to professional and then to the machinery takeover, they are in fact submitting to that process 100% almost. Why so? Because the university bureaucrats are making the universities look like corporations. The universities are no more different from the companies. Harvard is not all that different from GM. The Harvard president is no more very different from the GM executive. He probably makes as much money as the GM president makes, if not more. The Harvard is putting lots of, I mean, again, I'm talking about Harvard, I'm talking about all these Ivy League universities and others. They are putting, not just in this country, overseas as well, they are putting a lot of this money in investment, in all kinds of banks, in all kinds of technologies, in all kinds of, I don't know, companies and so on. They are making more money there than in either help from the states or from tuition. Tuition money is almost nothing. I mean, they don't care about tuition anymore. Because they make so much money out there. Again, the unfortunate fact is that I call it the bureaucratization of universities. The universities have become not just a corporatist, but bureaucratized. This bureaucratization, okay, has taken over the educational system. It is not the faculty, it is the bureaucrats in the universities that are devising rules and regulations and creating policies and directions for the universities. There was a time that the faculty had a role to play. No more. The faculties are increasingly told what to do. The universities are now increasingly monetized. There was a time that it was the discovery, it was the idea, it was the theory that meant a lot to universities. Now, what makes sense for the university as far as the faculty contribution goes is the grant the person brings in. Okay, we used to say publish or perish. Now we say grant or perish. Okay, and the question is, the grant is not seen as a means toward certain discoveries necessarily. Grant simply means that the university takes a part of it and puts in the pocket of the bureaucrats. If you look at the university foundations or the places where the university money is in a finance company, the finance department or whatever, they can see in some universities, the grant you bring, 60% of that money directly goes into the university pocket. 30% just goes into your research and everything else. See, it is the university is making you as a faculty to make money for the bureaucrats and for their wasteful management of everything else.
But in the light of all these budget cuts that most of the state universities have been experiencing, at least the state universities, if not private, the funding for the private universities was coming from foundations and the alumni and all the philanthropist activities that these private universities were conducting in the past. But state universities, which are the majority of the universities in the country, they have been facing budget cut after budget cut year after year, and they have to somehow keep their head above the water. And because of this, they're trying to kind of be imaginative in meeting their demands, meeting their budgets, and be able to pay the salary and keep the lights on. Now, what are the state universities like yours? Rutgers University, I suppose it's a major flagship university of the state of New Jersey. And do you know what percent of the budget comes from the state, and what percent comes from their investments in in the stock market and in other portfolios and independent economic activities?
Well, unfortunately, I don't, because the university doesn't discuss that with the faculty. It stays within the bureaucrats. That's one fact. That's true. That's honest. Okay, unless you really use this Free Information Act and go after it, and no faculty has the stomach to go for it. So 99% of the universities have no idea what's going on in the universities, particularly when it comes to the budget. Okay, and the universities have also made deals with the unions, and the unions are not after it. Every few times, they give you a few things here and there, and they basically tell you, for example, Rutgers, they said, Rutgers says, I have no money, and yet Rutgers has $800 million hidden somewhere that the bureaucrats are using. Well, things like that, okay? I think a sizable part of the Rutgers money used to come from the state. But here is the issue. The problem is, as I said, is a larger issue. It's not just the university, it's the companies, it's the state government. The state government is also monetized. The state government is also changed its mind from a state government that was to serve the public, the interest of the broader community. It is serving the interest of a few. All right? The state, unfortunately, is also has been transformed into a company, to a corporation. Okay, it just takes your tax, puts that tax in the pockets of the bureaucrats. There are tons of bureaucrats in the state that make, believe me, some of them make more money than the corporations make. This is a broader issue. So because the state is mismanaging, okay, it has to cut from somewhere. And that somewhere, the immediate somewhere is the university, because they don't believe in the kind of education that universities used to provide. The state simply comes to Rutgers and says, cut social sciences, cut humanities. Why do you need them? Save money from them. Put more money in engineering, in science, in physics, and chemistry and others, and go after grant and get money. Period. All right. So there is what I'm saying, a tripartite sort of the alliance here. The corporations, the state, and the universities. They think alike, and they work together in moving forward in the same direction of moving away from liberal social to physical, and then at the same time increasingly becoming monetized and that money, all right, will have to come from somewhere, all right, and that's somewhere. For example, I mean, there was a time that the universities used to pay, for the Rutgers, for example, the state used to pay a lot, probably 70% of the budget, around that number perhaps. Now, corporations are doing it. Rutgers is proud to announce every year that it has made more money from the companies than the state. Okay, but the corporate money is all conditioned. Corporations are not charity organizations. They don't give you just money to do whatever you want. You go and put, for example, grant for humanities, a new way of looking at the American society from a philosophical perspective. Do you think you will get grant from any corporation? No. Even when they say Exxon has a foundation called Exxon Education Foundation. Do you think Exxon Education Foundation gives money for liberal education to the American universities? No. It gives you money to that kind of branches that directly impacts its business, which is oil and gas, for example, energy, broadly speaking. So again, what I'm saying is Chevron has a foundation that does work in small communities where they have their own wells or their refineries and so on. You know, one time I asked the CEO of Chevron, who used to be at one point a friend of mine, I asked him, why do you put your money in that village in Africa or that place? He said, you know what, Hooshang, that's all public relations. It is all about public relations. You don't understand, you are a university professor. I am a businessman. I wanted the community where I live, I am working, see Chevron in good light. I wanted them to see Chevron, their brother, their side. I don't want them to see that I'm extracting their money. I'm extracting their oil or gas or whatever and pumping it out.
Well, that's the industry. I mean, I understand if Chevron wants to spend more money on public relations, they have, an interest in Africa or in the Middle East or somewhere else. But if you look at the annual budget of the U.S. government, different departments, last year the U.S. spent $750 billion on defense, which is basically the budget of the Department of Defense, DoD. On the other hand, the budget of the Department of Education was $68 billion, which is less than 1/10 of the money we spend on defense. And the budget for National Institute of Health, NIH, which basically pays for all the research in academia in this country, lion's shares of research. The academia, different institutions sometimes partner with industry and pharmaceutical companies, and they can get some money that way. But majority of the faculty's money in medical school, in the colleges of medicine and sciences related to medicine and healthcare comes from the National Institute of Health, NIH, which is annual budget last year was $52 billion. So $52 billion for NIH, $68 billion for education departments, and $750 billion for the DoD. Do you think that has a role to play in not supporting our education and not training the students and faculty and future citizens who are more sensitive to democracy to consolidate democracy and participate and put more emphasis on defense and on manufacturing and public relations, as you say?
Absolutely. In fact, as I said, universities are just submitting to what the pressure that comes from the companies and the state. All right. Unfortunately, the university is not responding appropriately. They just are submitting. They are not, as I said, striking a balance between that demand and the public demand. Okay, and this is a very, very dangerous situation because this is a vicious circle. for example, the more corporations go in the direction that they are going and trying to increasingly master and produce the nature and produce whatever they want to do, increasingly they are going to disturb the environment, create more problems of not just social but physical nature. And then the more the physical problems become pronounced, the more universities are told to go in that direction, to provide solutions, and therefore they change the direction of its educational programs toward solving those physical problems. So in a way, you have a group of people out there that are in the front, destroying stuff, creating physical problems, aside from the social. And then the universities are asked to follow them and clean up the mess, and therefore change their educational system. And that way, and that the state is doing the same, and the federal government is doing the same. Remember, the federal government, the state, they all are the agents of these corporations. Bottom line, they really have very little relative autonomy even left. They used to have relative autonomy vis-a-vis the corporations. I'm talking about the state and the federal government, but increasingly less so. They are increasingly submitting to that demand, because that demand is not just coming from the company now, of American company, that is coming from an international class of people that operating globally, and that they have become increasingly unruly and uncontrollable by the federal government and the state for sure. So they are the master of the ceremonies out there. I call them the global the economic leaders or corporate leaders, that they are Chinese, Japanese, American, European, Indians, you call it Koreans, and so on and so forth. This class of people, they have a brotherhood between them. They compete, but at the same time, they are a class in themselves. They have their own interests aside from the interests of everybody in that global society. So you have a global leadership, a global people, a global corporate leaders versus a global community that are leaderless or just general public. And the state supposedly, or the federal government was supposedly to be on the side of the general public, but increasingly less so, increasingly submitting to that demand on the higher level, that their pretext is that unless we help our companies, they will be defeated by the Chinese companies, by the Japanese companies, or European. So then, and at the same time, we have to protect them, and because of that, we have to put $700 billion in our defense budget, for example. So again, as you can see, and then the $700 billion, of course, comes from where? From all kinds of stuff, but largely also from cutting social programs. Not the social program in terms of food, health and education and others, but also from what they used to spend on liberal and social sciences. If tomorrow Rutgers was to be forced into cutting 10 departments for whatever reason, you know what the department would be? Economics, sociology, philosophy. That's true. Okay, these will go immediately. What will remain? It's ceramic engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and a few other places. So that's what it is. So again, what I'm saying is, I'm not sure even in 10, 15, 20 years, we will have social science to begin with. or humanities to begin with the way we are going. Even if we have them, there will be somewhere in a very corner in a campus that nobody sees, and it would be a ghetto, okay, in the university. Okay, so again, over the last 20-some years, Rutgers has been building new structures in the campus. You think who is for whom they are being built? For sociology department? No, it's still sociology department is still in a shithole at Rutgers. You know what I mean? It's still economics department is still is in a place that is, I don't know, 500 years old, 200 years old, 150 years old. But go look at biotechnology building. Go see the engineering building. God forbid, every day they are prosperous. And
so
companies.
Universities, when it comes to division of resources, they shouldn't really go based on the supply and demand, and they should have a different set of criteria for supporting various departments and training forces for the economy, training youngsters and young people for the future of this economy. You're saying that if we don't have a long-reaching vision into the future and don't remedy this problem, the problem of more emphasis on social sciences and on humanity, we are going to train students who are not going to be aware of the history of their country, of the philosophy of liberal democracy, of the strength of our economy, and they're just going to go for the highest bid. And eventually, when they become the CEOs of these big corporations, and when the balance sheet at the end of the year shows them that if they close shop in the United States and take their company to China or to Bangladesh or to Vietnam, they're going to do that, and they're going to leave this country out in the cold as some of the big corporations have done so. So this is really a matter of chicken and egg problem. On the one hand, we want to be sensitive to the forces of marketplace and train people based on the demand in the economy. On the other hand, we see that if we carry on doing that, we are going to basically encourage and facilitate our subcontracting all of manufacturing technology and manufacturing capabilities to the overseas competition, as well as the departure of and flight of capital and science and technology from our own country to other countries, as it has happened in the last 40 years. And as a result, the economy and the quality of life will suffer in this country. So you're saying that if we interfere at this point and try to put more emphasis and educate even our engineers, not only train more humanity majors and make the humanity a more attractive program and increase the share of the job market for them. In addition to that, actually put some emphasis on the humanity and the social science education, liberal art education aspect of engineering and science and technology training in the universities, right?
Yes, well, first, we are not, I want to be clear here, we are not arguing against engineering or professional sciences or professional education. What we are saying is, if you are creating an engineer, create a complete engineer. A complete engineer is not someone who knows only how to draw maps or how to do mathematics. A complete engineer is someone who appreciates human rights, that appreciates democracy, that appreciates peace. If you have an engineer who doesn't appreciate this, that is a dangerous engineer. That engineer doesn't create a sustainable society. It will lead the society into destruction, even if that engineer can make the best machines, the best buildings. At the end of the day, that particular engineer will be a destructive engineer because he has no sense of humanities. He has no appreciation for a good life, for a good society. He has no appreciation for democracy, for critical thinking. So that is why, for example, in the last session, I proposed that we we do something very sort of innovative, and I propose diffusion of social science or liberal science into professional education. That is, in all professional schools, in engineering schools, there must be at least one course that will be required for all engineers to take, that will tell them about the history of their country, the culture of the country, all about human rights, about democracy. I mean, all kinds, perhaps 2 courses. I mean, you take, I mean, from out of the 140 some units that a bachelor can take, can't they take, you know, at least 6 or 8 or 10 of them, units of them in this education? I mean, it's just not acceptable. Or for the, you know, master or others who have to, you know, pass 60 credits, couldn't they take like 6 credits on something that would be diffused into that specific job? The point I'm trying to make is we are not against this professional education. What we are saying is this professional education, as it is going forward, it is doing 2 things. First, creating engineers and professionals that really can do the best when it comes to mapping and engineering, but they are not a complete human being. They have no sense of humanity. And that's a dangerous human being. And that's number one. And second, that person that has no sense of humanity and it's just only a person that does engineering is moving in the direction that ultimately makes nature take over even that very person. It is creating robots that is now controlling that engineer as well. So engineer who doesn't have a liberal, a critical education cannot understand that the way it's moving forward in its field will ultimately destroy himself as well. That very engineer is doing things like, for example, building robots that will destroy that engineer's job. But the engineer, because he doesn't have critical thinking education, cannot understand it, cannot see it. If an engineer who can see it can do it in a way that will always be in control of that machine. All right, so again, unfortunately, I have to tell you, we may be even late in reversing anything. And the corporate life is so dominant, and the demand from that education is so dominant that universities have given up, individuals have given up, societies have given up, and so on. Maybe, I think if there is a revolution from the bottom up, that should be a revolution for liberal education. I think, as opposed to the class revolution, opposed to the like critical race theory and all that, I think the critical race theory or the class theory, they really have lost. What we need to think is more, okay, critical education theory. We have to make a critical education movement. The next movement has to be critical education movement. A movement for liberal education, for humanities, for social science, but not just humanities and social science, but even then from a critical perspective.
The US spent $6 trillion in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. What would have happened to the education in this country? So I gave you the budget for the share of the federal budget for the Department of Education, which is $68 billion. So $6 trillion is roughly 1,000 times is the budget of the Department of Education for 1,000 years. So in other words, if we didn't spend all that money in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know, we have basically nothing to show for it, right? We have nothing to show for it. It seems like, you know, the situation in Afghanistan is going back to Taliban taking the upper hand there, and we withdrew from Iraq, and we are almost withdrawing from the rest of the Middle East. And the $6 trillion that we invested in that part of the world seems like it didn't produce enough rate of return for the citizens of the United States. what would have happened if we had invested that $60 billion in education and infrastructure, educational infrastructures in this country? What kind of a country would have been, and how much contribution would have been made in stabilizing this democracy?
A lot. That would be a revolution indeed. But unfortunately, the guys who are behind this wars, the military industrial complex in this country, they make money from it. They don't care about liberal education. They think that $6 billion that was spent in Afghanistan really has been well spent. They don't think like me and you. You know, we are talking about a good society. See, our definition of a good society is exactly what you say. Take that $6 billion, put in education, and educate people, train people, make them capable of living, enjoying, and making their life. But that other group that pushes for this wars doesn't think that a good society is that society. It's a good society that is a military industrial society that takes that money, puts in military industrial complex, and go and fights for what? For making more money. Remember, we say there is a misunderstanding here. They say one side, not the other part of it. They say we spent $6 billion in Afghanistan for no reason. But the fact is that there was a reason. That $6 billion wasn't just simply spent, disappeared. It went from this pocket of the United States into this pocket of the United States. It came from my tax and went into the military industrial complexes pocket. See, most people don't tell you the full story. They say we spent so much in Iraq. Yes, but who took that money? We conquered Iraq. So much we spent. Exxon now has the biggest business in oil fields in Iraq. You know? So again, they tell you half of the story. The fact is, there is a group out there that benefits from this so-called waste. For us, it's a waste, and truly is a waste, and factually is a waste. But for them, that's not a waste. It's just a matter of choice. You could spend here or you could spend there. We think it should be spent here because we believe in a good society this way. But they think no, it is well spent there because they think that the good society is there that way. See, that is the problem. Now, that is why I said it would have been a revolution between two complete way of thinking about a good society, a good America. Okay, and that is why I said the next revolution has to be a revolution for this society, for this America, an America that educates their people, an America that makes their people capable of enjoying life. You see, development, now these days we define development as creating capabilities, making capable of enjoying, making life, and that capability frees them from all kinds of constraints that they face. So at the end of the day, that democracy is part of that freedom. Okay, unless you create this capability that frees people, you cannot create democracy. That is why the democracy in this country is going down the drain.
So that you consider investment in education as investment in the country, and it will have a much higher rate of return in terms of economic productivity and development of new industries and the stability of the democracy, as opposed to the investments in military industrial complexes that thrive on wars and on conflicts. And actually, I have to make a slight correction when I said that the money we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, which was $6 trillion, was 1,000 times the budget. It's actually 100 times the budget.
By the way, I also said trillion. I should have said, I said billion, I believe. I have to correct it. Trillion.
So $6 trillion is about 100 times the annual budget of the Department of Education. Of course, you know, in the interest of accuracy, we have to here mention that most of the burden of education is on the state governments, and the state is supposed to fund primary and the secondary education and contribute to the budget of the major flagship state universities, and the budget of the U.S. government probably only contributes to about 10% of the overall expenditure on education in this country. And when you put all the resources that spend on the education together, probably we are spending as much on education, roughly around $700 billion a year, as we are spending on the defense. But the question is that any dollar that goes into education, it will generate patriotism. It will generate aware citizens and informed citizens, citizens who, you know, they say people who are ignorant of the history are bound to repeat it. And educating our students and our young men and women who eventually end up running corporations and running the economy, running the universities and running this country as a whole, the more they are aware and educated about their past, about the place of the United States in the world, about the values of democracy, and how fragile it is, and how all of us as citizens, I mean, the security of this country is not entirely on the burden and the responsibility of the US government, but every ordinary citizen has to really contribute in the security. Napoleon Bonaparte has been quoted as saying that revolutionaries launched the revolution and informed citizens watch guard the achievements of revolution. So informed citizen is what really all this story of our conversation is all about. How we train informed citizens who will go around running this country and making this country more secure. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for you to wrap things up in the context of the topics we covered today before we have to sign off. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well said. Let me say that every country that really developed started with education. Education from the beginning was the foundation of development in the US, Europe, in China, Africa, South Korea. Countries that did not make education a foundation lost. And here, education really started with liberal education, and it started with a very sort of like a universal education, you know, up to the 12th grade with, you know, a forced education that the state had to take care of it, and so on and so forth. So education at that time was not just a foundation of development of progress, but seen as a basic rights of human being, a part of the human rights. Education, like food, was a human rights. And that kind of education, universal education, was a human rights issue. Unfortunately, in the course of the development, as we moved away from social or liberal education, generally speaking, into this professional education, that education became a completely different education. It became an education that will create, quote unquote, human capital. We create human capital, and the human capital is the capability of the laborer to produce more value or surplus value or profit. Okay, that's where we went wrong. Okay, that's where we went wrong. We went from a liberal education that was part of our human rights, universal, forced, and paid for, to an education that now is trying to create human capital, just like money capital, like technology. They wanted to make people into technology and a bunch of animals that can just produce, as opposed to
that's a good breaking point. education as human right. This is something that we're going to pick up next time. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this continuation of this exciting conversation. I want to thank you very much, Professor Amirahmadi, for being so gracious with your time.
My pleasure.
Helping us with all the insight that you have about the relation between democracy and education. And we're going to say goodbye to our audience, and we will see them next week at the same time. Thank you for helping us. Thank you.
And thank you for having me.